private conversations that, I've had with the president. I want to keep those private. But I do think that, as an industry, we really have a choice to make between someone who is working with us and engaging in productive dialogue with our industry, with our community, and someone who hates our industry, has told us, in the not nicest way that we, are criminals. And I think, when we compare the current position of the Democratic Party against the Republican Party, it's very hard to rally around the Democratic case for Bitcoin.
Bitcoin still reached a record under the current administration, and there were 2 spot ETFs approved. Why is it seen that this administration was so tough on Bitcoin when so much had gotten done?
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight that the way the spot ETF got approved is we had to sue the SEC. So it wasn't like they gladly did that. It was a multi-year litigation. And so, it has been pulling teeth this entire time to work with the current administration. They have blocked public offerings from going to market. They have cracked down on developers. They've arrested developers. They've proposed horrific tax policies and tax schemes for Bitcoin mining. So it's been a very tough administration to work with. And only since we have started, supporting the President Trump's campaign have we seen a pivot in messaging from the Democratic Party that, hey, maybe we do want to work with you.
Okay, and David, we only have 30 seconds left, but what would you have to hear from the Harris campaign to call her pro-crypto?
It's beyond having to hear from her because she's in power right now. If she wants to start to reset the relationship, she needs to not sell America's Bitcoin. She needs to fire Gary Gensler today, and she needs to free Ross Ulbricht from prison today. And so they can't be words because she's actively in charge of the country right now. She needs to act on those 3 things, and then we at least would be in a place where we can have a productive dialogue.
All right.
That is David Bailey of the Bitcoin conference. Of course, they are gearing up for the next one next year in the West Coast. We will talk more about that at another date. But coming up, we're going to continue the election conversation with the CEO of Bitcoin miner CleanSpark. That conversation up next. This is Bloomberg.
Let's get to the state of the crypto mining business. CleanSpark owns 6,500 Bitcoin in total. CEO Zach Bradford joins us now. Zach, good to see you. Before we get to the state of the business, I do want to talk a little politics here, coming fresh off of President Trump's appearance on Saturday. You certainly argued that that was historic, what we saw at the Bitcoin conference. I'll pose the same question to you. What do you need to see from Vice President Harris to convince you that she would support crypto in the White House?
You know, it was a historic moment. We now have two presidential candidates that have come out in favor of Bitcoin, between Kennedy and also Trump. I think I agree with what David said. Action's required. When you're currently in power, you shouldn't be held to a standard of talking about what you're going to do. It should be about what you are doing. It's been a tough road for the industry. There hasn't been a lot that's made it easy to, progress forward. And I think that we need to see an open mind. The thing that I'm most disappointed about is there was not a single person from the other side of the aisle at the conference. And, in addition to former President Trump being there, there was a lot of senators, there were governors, there were a lot of individuals there, but they were all from one side of the aisle. And I think that from a party line approach, there needs to be reaching out to the industry, gaining an understanding, and then taking action for those that are currently in power.
Zach, I have a question about the content of the speech here. A lot of what former President Trump was talking about was electricity, the need for more electricity to really fuel this Bitcoin industry. Do the clean efforts go away in the Bitcoin mining industry in a future potential Trump administration?
No, I don't think so. CleanSpark, we pride ourselves in being one of the most or the least carbon intensive miners in the country. Last year in our sustainability report, we cited over 80% carbon-free power. Almost no other industry is pushing as hard as the Bitcoin mining industry has been into this carbon-free narrative. Something that has been broadly cited is the only way to achieve our future energy goals for this country, which includes electric vehicles, which includes all the AI and the data center innovation that needs to happen, but also Bitcoin mining. What is needed from there is probably nuclear power. That's going to be something that our country needs to develop and transition into. The benefit that Bitcoin miners have, of course, is we can use power that would otherwise go unused. For example, at the edge of the grid, when a new asset is deployed, on average, it's underutilized for 5 years. That is the perfect place for Bitcoin miners to be. It's why we've developed so much in rural areas. And that energy ultimately creates prosperity in those communities. But I don't think that the clean, part of this needs to go out the window. I think that all industries, not just Bitcoin mining, not just data centers, we all want clean air. We all want clean water to drink, and it's up to all of us to get it done. But we need more power. We're never going to save ourselves into an abundant future.
Can you do this on your own? Can the industry do it on its own, or does it need government intervention to provide that power?
What we need is we can probably do it on our own. We don't need government intervention to create the power or to create the opportunity. What we need a government that's not going to stand in the way. Ultimately, that's been our request, and we've made this publicly and broadly.
Zach,
we're not asking for anything special. We
gotta leave it there. That is CleanSpark CEO Zach Bradford. Sorry, we're heading up against the clock, but we appreciate your time today.
Back,
and
Zach.
Of course, very critical moment after that speech from the Bitcoin conference. Everything being touched on, from the sake of electricity to political rhetoric around this election. But for now, that does it for Bloomberg Crypto. Join us again, same time, same place next week. This is Bloomberg.
Is everything.
Welcome to Bloomberg Markets. I'm Scarlett Fu. Let's take a look at where things stand in financial markets this Tuesday afternoon. We have big tech dragging down the broader market before earnings from Microsoft today, Meta, Amazon, and Apple all this week. And you could see the S&P 500 losing ground near about session lows, off by 0.7%. The Mag 7 down more than 2% at the moment. The small caps continue to outperform. It is red, but the Russell is up almost 9% in the last 2.5 weeks since that cooler than expected CPI print for the month of June kind of changed things around. In terms of currencies, dollar yen bouncing around right now, dollar weaker versus the yen before the BOJ meets tonight and the Fed announces its decision tomorrow afternoon. Of course, it started its two-day meeting today. As we mentioned, it is a busy earnings week, so let's go straight to Abigail Doolittle, who's got our latest movers. Abigail?
Yeah, lots of movers to cover here. Let's start off with the shares of JetBlue, which are up 15.7%. This is the best day since February of this year. At the highs, I believe at that point, the stock up 23%. The best day since 2020. That's the degree of buying power for this somewhat beaten down airline. They talked about lots of positive things that all go to the idea of cost cutting, including they are exiting 14 cities. They are deferring 44 Airbus plane deliveries, and they've also cut more than 50 routes. To the downside, though, we have a couple of stocks that are dragging in a big way, including Procter & Gamble, shares down nearly 6%. They put up a mixed quarter. They missed sales estimates. The organic growth, the slowest, I should say, in 6 quarters, as they're unable to raise prices a ton. It really suggests that there's an intolerance on the part of consumers for higher prices, inflation that we've been wondering about for a while. Take a look at Merck, down nearly 10%. This is the worst day since November of 2021 at the session lows, the worst day going all the way back to 2008. This is they cut their full year guide, with the company highlighting China weakness. Taking a look at CrowdStrike, because the weakness extends. It's really incredible. Since the failed upgrade, the debacle, this stock down 42%, 12% of it coming today. This after Delta hired a very prominent attorney to seek possible compensation for the outage that affected them and delayed so many of their flights. And then finally, Microsoft, of course, the outage having to do with Microsoft Windows. Today, Microsoft this morning actually talking about having some outage. We don't know if it's related to CrowdStrike, or at least I don't at this point, to Office and cloud features. They, of course, will be reporting tonight. Super interesting, Scarlett, is the slowing growth. Sales expected to be up 15% versus 17% in the last quarter sequentially, and then earnings expected to grow by 10% versus 20% the quarter prior. So it's interesting to note that sequential slowdown. Will they deliver?
Yeah, still double-digit growth, but as you noted, sequential, so that does raise a lot of eyebrows. Abigail, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle there for us with the big movers, many of them decliners. So on top of Microsoft this afternoon, we also get results from Meta, Apple, and Amazon later this week. Let's bring it all together and discuss those Mag 7 earnings with Bloomberg Technology co-host Ed Ludlow. So, Ed, let's start with Microsoft here, because Abigail told us about the sequential decline in revenue and in profits. But the big question mark here is CapEx, as it's been for all the Mag 7 companies.
Exactly. Basically, spending on infrastructure that supports AI translating into top-line growth. So overall, the street sees 15% revenue growth, but the biggest contribution coming from 30% growth in cloud infrastructure. And you'll remember last quarter that the thing that investors are trying to work out is like the language and data that the C-suite give us. So what Amy Hood, the CFO over at Microsoft, said is we had 30% revenue growth last quarter, 7% contribution came from AI, selling AI services. And it's hard to find that interconnect. I think you and I talked this week about the money machine, money in, spending on infrastructure, how many dollars are coming out in terms of growth?
Yeah, that is a big question mark, and they don't give a lot of details like that, so everyone really seized upon that 7 points of growth last time around. Right. Do we expect Nadella to say a little bit more on that? I mean, do we expect him to maybe say that that pace has picked up in the last quarter?
I think so. I mean, one thing that Microsoft's very good at is selling software, and even though we're kind of very excited about the words artificial and intelligence, what Microsoft's done is taken its relationship with OpenAI. They've built lots of data centers to basically support AI that's value add to all the things they already sold. Microsoft Office, the easiest example. And so with that, there is evidence that whether you're an enterprise or you're a consumer, the adoption of those things is happening. It's real. The curious thing about it is the competitive landscape. A lot of that software you can get for free elsewhere.
Yeah.
You know, you could use ChatGPT, the base model from OpenAI, without having to pay for it. And so that's an interesting dynamic that maybe Nadella and Hood can address going forward. The willingness of enterprises and consumers to pay for something that might otherwise be a freebie elsewhere.
What about Meta? Because we've seen Meta, certainly if you use Facebook or Instagram, the AI function comes up a lot.
Yes.
Are we expecting that to translate into some kind of revenue boost this quarter?
The street certainly hopes so. I think, last quarter was a really interesting one in the context of covering technology. Mark Zuckerberg said definitively, we think that Meta can be the world's leading AI company. And different to a Microsoft where it's trying to take its work and put it into an enterprise software package, Meta has to work out how its work in AI relates to its social networks and its work on the metaverse. In other words, using hardware in the augmented and virtual reality use case.
Which hasn't gone so well.
It hasn't gone so well, but has a revival, so to speak. So, I'm on many different Meta platforms, WhatsApp, Instagram, and you will notice that the AI agent is now kind of commonplace in the search bar.
Right.
How do you make money from that? And, they are the loudest advocate for open source when it comes to developing large language models and AI. That gives them a leadership position. But again, they've spent a lot of money. They upgraded CapEx guidance last quarter. What do they have to show for it in top line growth is the question. I don't have the answer right now.
Okay, so that also extends to Amazon and Apple as
Big
well. When it comes to Apple, it's a hardware company. And so we're going to look for some kind of commentary on what the new AI-enabled iPhones, which will eventually go on sale later this year, will bring. So it's a lot of anticipation, less about the quarter past, right?
Apple is very much focused on the commentary and guidance or soft guidance that Luca Maestri, in particular, the CFO, gives. What are they going to tell us about real-time data, in those markets? Then it becomes an issue of chronology. The new generation of iPhone usually comes out in September. Mark Gurman, the Bloomberg News reporter who covers Apple, reported earlier this week that Apple Intelligence, its generative AI platform, is going to come out delayed from when the new iPhone comes out. So you buy the new iPhone in September, you're probably going to wait a few weeks for a software update that gives you access to those tools. It's a few weeks, but I think the market was like, well, hold on, we traded this stock on the idea you guys got your act together on AI, and they want to see some evidence of that it will be in consumer hands with a firm date and how that translates to the App Store and downloading more or paying for more services.
Okay, and I just want to throw in Amazon in there as well, because Google Cloud had some decent results last week, which seemed to bode well for Microsoft's Azure and also for Amazon Web Services, although AWS is kind of the market leader here.
It is the clear market leader, but Alphabet and Amazon are analogous in the sense that we're all hyped up about AI and cloud growth. Alphabet said pretty definitively that their legacy and core search product was their biggest contributor to top-line growth. Amazon AWS continues to be the cash cow, but there are other areas that surprise us, advertising being one. Their Prime Day window, did that have something beneficial for growth from e-commerce? I think the Amazon story, it's always hard to understand the sum of its parts, but just like Apple, everyone's going, when do we get the AI Alexa? And that might be a big question as well.
All right, well, certainly those will be questions that investors will be asking when the results come out. Ed, always a pleasure to have you here. Ed Ludlow, co-host of Bloomberg Technology, and he'll be joining us later on as we break down those earnings. Now, coming up, Starbucks reports after the closing bell as the company sees a drop in demand across the world, particularly in markets like China where there is stiff competition. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm Scarlett Fu. It's time now for our stock of the hour, and we're watching Starbucks. Little change at the moment in terms of share price, but down a fifth of its value so far this year. Investors are closely watching a pullback in demand from North America to China when it reports after the closing bell. So let's bring in Bloomberg Intelligence senior restaurant analyst Michael Halen to give us a little more insight here. And I mentioned the stock is down 22% this year. It's very much in need of a turnaround story. I guess the first question for you is, what is the good news story that Starbucks is going to try to tell this afternoon?
Well, some of the data that we've seen, we've had some work done for us by an AI and machine learning company, Cognovi Labs, to analyze social media posts. We've had some work done by our team at Bloomberg from Second Measure, and they seem to think that traffic has improved a little bit here in the second quarter, in the calendar second quarter in the U.S. So that's kind of the good news. But some of the concerns we have are really about how they're driving that, right? Like in the United States, they had these breakfast pairing meals where they're starting to push through discounts. And so, to us in the short term, that may help boost results. But over the long term, you're training your customers that, the items on your menu aren't worth what you're selling them for, right? And you're actually training them to not come to your store unless there's some sort of discount offered.
Right. They could just look at the retailers and the car makers for guidance on what happens there. So that's the North America story. China is a whole different beast here because the same-store sales are estimated to decline about 10.6%. We know the economic backdrop is very difficult for Starbucks, and there's also a lot of domestic competition that Starbucks faces.
Yeah, the Chinese economy is weak, to your point, and there's a lot of competition, and the competition's coming from much cheaper options from Luckin, McDonald's, and KFC. Starbucks for a latte is 3 times the price of those competitors, right? And so, right now they're under a lot of pressure. And I don't think that their initiatives seem to make much sense, right? They debuted 27 new items last quarter to try to boost traffic, right? But, that's only going to hurt your throughput, and it's not going to bring customers in that are looking for, some sort of a cheaper item, right? And so the fact that they're getting a lot of pressure from the lower, cheaper mass merchant coffee competitors is definitely causing them a lot of problems right now in China.
Okay, so these are kind of structural issues that they need to deal with in addition to the fact that the Chinese economy is weak and consumer sentiment is really not all that strong at the moment. We know that there's been reporting on Elliott Management coming in and building a stake in Starbucks. No word on how big that stake is. I know that you've written about the kinds of things that Starbucks needs to do to get its stock price going. What are you looking for to hear from Elliott Management as they start to really dig in their heels and talk to management about what could be done?
Yeah, we think that they're going to push for a couple of board seats and potentially a management change. What we've written is that a lot of these initiatives management has kind of pushed through don't seem to make sense for us. We want them to get back to the basics of running great restaurants, right? And so they kind of make it tough on themselves because they talk a lot about improving throughput and running great restaurants, but at the same time, they're offering 27 new items in China. They're offering all sorts of new items in the United States, including energy drinks and boba tea type items, right? And so these initiatives kind of contradict one another, right? Mm-hmm. They talk about, keeping their premium positioning in China, right? But at the same time, they're moving into third-tier cities, right? And so to us, a lot of these initiatives don't really make sense. We think we expect Elliott to really hold their feet to the fire and try to get them kind of on a back-to-basics mentality.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll see how that all shakes out and what they say, if anything, on the conference call about that. Bloomberg Intelligence analyst Michael Halen giving us a preview of what to expect when Starbucks reports after the close. Now, coming up here on Bloomberg Markets, Bill Ackman's IPO may raise 1/10 of what the hedge fund manager had originally anticipated as one of the major investors pulled out of the deal. This is Bloomberg.
Wednesday. The Fed decides.
Who said summers were quiet? I don't remember the last quiet summer.
We're talking about the data not being as accurate during this time of year, an election that's haywire.
Trust Bloomberg to bring you the fastest coverage and exclusive analysis, including Powell's press conference.
Is the answer here, Jeff, that everything is just plain solid?
It's pretty solid, Tom.
At some point, we got to call it a soft landing.
Tune in to Bloomberg Surveillance. The Fed decides, starting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern.
This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm Scarlett Fu. Now, Bill Ackman's Pershing Square is preparing to go public next week. The billionaire originally targeted a $25 billion debut for his closed-end fund, but that is now looking closer to around $2 billion. Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's Bailey Lipschultz. And Bailey, you've been covering this for a while, so let's just take a big step back, a big step back. From $25 billion to maybe $2 billion. What happened?
So he came out and was kind of talking up that $25 billion mark, Scarlett, in a town hall earlier in the month when they were first starting these roadshows, meeting with investors one-on-one, courting the million-plus retail followers that follow him on X, formerly known as Twitter, and really talked up the fact that $20 to $25 billion could be the target for that. Then we saw a few weeks later, last week, saying they're going to cap it at $10 billion, but in a letter that ended up having to be published in a filing with the SEC, he told some of his current investors, 2.4 to 5 billion, or 2.5 to 4 billion dollars, and then today's filing below all of that.
So in the process of these numbers being adjusted lower, the SEC has delayed regulatory approval of the IPO. It's supposed to go public this week. It's not going to happen until later on.
Yeah, we saw when they first launched their pretty lengthy roadshow that they were targeting a deal pricing yesterday evening that would then debut today. Because of that letter, according to the firm, they had to file that with the SEC. That's held things up. They're now, according to term sheets that we've seen, targeting a pricing next week on Monday with trading on Tuesday. But when I talk to some closed-end fund specialists, they aren't completely sold on that timing just because that filing still hasn't been declared effective by the SEC, which is a requirement before that IPO.
Okay, so first things first, SEC has to okay everything. The big issue here is that Seth Klarman of Baupost has decided against investing in the fund. Who are the backers of this fund then, of this closed-end fund?
Well, when we look at that letter that he sent to current Pershing proper investors, he laid out Baupost, he laid out Putnam, he laid out the Teachers of Texas. Now I can't find the
Pension Fund
of Texas teachers as people who were already spoken for. And then we broke yesterday, Bloomberg, that Baupost actually opted not to be in for that $150 million mark. Still talking up his relationships, it seems to be behind the scenes. But the big question is, $2 billion is still a lot of money, but it's a small fraction of what he had talked up. How much comes from institutions? How much comes from retailers? That's really something we're going to be keeping an eye on.
All right. This is great. And of course, you were behind the reporting that indicated that Bill Ackman was really holding up Berkshire Hathaway as a model for this closed-end fund ahead of the IPO, which we think at this point may take place next week. Bailey, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now, let's stay with Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway and turn to another billionaire, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. It is selling its shares of Bank of America. It's unloaded $3 billion of the stock this month alone. Now, Berkshire still owns almost $40 billion of the bank. Bloomberg's Catherine Doherty has been looking into this. Is this a surprise? Because I believe a year ago he was saying that he wanted to stay put in Bank of America.
It wasn't that many months ago. This is his biggest pullback of his investment that he originally made. It was a bet back in 2011 where he was saying Bank of America and CEO Brian Moynihan, I believe in their ability to turn this business around. Coming out of the financial crisis, they were dealing with billions of dollars of liabilities that they had to clean up.
From Countrywide,
a lot of these mortgages that they had then inherited. And along the way, Berkshire has continued to build his stake in Bank of America. He has signaled his support of the bank, of Moynihan. So these recent sales, yes. The surprise is just the fact that it's happening. It's been that many years since 2011 that he's just built. He hasn't been selling. Now he is selling. The question is, when do those sales stop and how big does it get?
Right. Now, Warren Buffett / Berkshire Hathaway is still the biggest shareholder in Bank of America. That has not changed, even with the paring down of the stake. You mentioned that he invested in Brian Moynihan. They speak a great deal. Has he said anything else about Brian Moynihan in recent weeks or months?
So they've been very quiet. Beyond, it's the comparison to Ackman is actually quite astute. Ackman going out there using words. Berkshire, not words. These are actions, but actions are potentially speaking louder than words. So yes, you make a very good point that Berkshire is still the largest shareholder of Bank of America by a wide margin. So these shares, even though they're selling worth $3 billion, they're still the biggest shareholder. So the support is still there. It's not as if it's a signal of complete distrust or a turnaround in how he is positioning or looking at the investment in the bank. However, if they get below the 10% mark, right now they're at the 12% ownership threshold, then they will likely stop having to declare these sales and it will be less public. So his maneuvering and his decision making of his investment in Bank of America might become less of a signal that we as the public can see out in the market like we've seen in recent days.
Now, we need to put this into context because Warren Buffett has been making changes to his holdings of U.S. banks since the regional banking turmoil of last year, right? I mean, he exited, I believe, U.S. Bancorp as well as Bank of New York Mellon. So he's been tweaking his holdings of U.S. banks, which makes him the ultimate value investors because financials have not done as well as they could have.
That's right. But when he was tweaking and pulling out of some of those banks that you note, he was emphasizing his support of Bank of America and of Brian Moynihan. So this is the distinction here. Now, I'll also note that when the sales were happening about 2 weeks ago, it was the day or so after Bank of America reported its second quarter earnings, and they were earnings that beat analyst expectations. The stock hit an all-time 2-year high, and so he really timed this right, and there have been subsequent sales at lower prices, so between 44 and 41, which is where the shares are trading around today, and really we haven't seen much market reaction from the news of Buffett selling. So that might be an indication that this was something folks have been monitoring along the way.
All right. Well, it's fascinating. And of course, we'll keep an eye on what happens with that stake. Now 12%, but perhaps shrinking to below 10% if we continue to watch him pull back on that stake. Catherine Doherty, thank you. This is Bloomberg.
And Bloomberg has the report under surveillance.
Do you think the jury's still out on the strength of the labor market?
Well, part of the problem is that July is usually a very bad month for jobless claims accuracy.
This Friday, Jonathan, Lisa, Anne-Marie, and Mike will bring you crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed.
We see the jobless numbers climb just bit by bit by bit. Is this a welcome cooling or an unwelcome deterioration?
The July Jobs Report, Friday on Bloomberg. From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Kamala Harris heads to Georgia with Democrats now hoping to expand the map. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As the Harris campaign hits the road, both the Harris and Trump campaigns are out with new ads today. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington, D.C. And Kaylee, it's fascinating. Both up with their first salvos, but both are ads about Kamala Harris.
Yeah, Kamala Harris's ad is about her record as being a quote-unquote fearless prosecutor for the most part, a $50 million ad buy coming from her campaign, whereas the first tranche of Donald Trump's ad buy, $12 million, is also about Harris, specifically her record, or rather this administration's record when it comes to the border and immigration.
Dangerously liberal, she's called. You see her dancing there at the hip-hop celebration that took place a couple of months ago. Interesting to play them both against each other here, which we're going to do coming up with our political panel a little bit later in this hour. Kaylee, it just speaks to the fact that both campaigns are trying to identify this new element at the top of the Democratic ticket.
Yeah, so much has changed in the period of just, 8 days? We're talking here.
Sounds about right, yeah.
It's been a very short haul, and it's obviously been a rapid-fire effort to get these ads up with the new political reality we are facing. In the meantime, of course, as we consider them running in swing states like Arizona, there's also some congressional primaries in that state we're watching, and we'll have more ahead with John Seaton.
Happy primary day, by the way. We haven't gotten to that yet. Michelle Jamrisco will be with us as we follow the Harris campaign to Georgia. To your point, John Seaton, an insider when it comes to Republican and specifically Arizona politics, will be able to learn a lot together this hour.
Indeed, we will. Happy primary day to you all. Happy primary day to Charlie Pellet. Although, Charlie, it's looking like it's not a super happy day in equity markets up in New York.
Exactly. I was just about to say not such a happy day, at least for the bulls on Wall Street right now. We got ourselves a tech sell-off underway, not just selling, but lows of the day right now, right to the numbers, with the S&P down 60 at 54.02, a drop right now of 1.1%, again underscoring lows of the session. The Dow holding on to an 8-point gain, little change there. The NASDAQ Composite Index also at the low of the session, down another 353 points, lower now by 2%. 10-year yield 4.12%, the 2-year 4.34%. Spot gold up just about 85 cents the ounce right now, up 0.8%, I should say, up $21 the ounce, 24.05 on spot gold. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.6%, 75.31 a barrel. And to be clear again, gold up by 0.9%, 24.09. Big tech sell-off underway right now. All eyes on Microsoft after the close of trading. The first of 4 mega cap tech names reporting this week. Microsoft down now by 2%. Meta Platforms reports tomorrow, down 1.8%. Apple and Amazon on Thursday. Apple right now down 0.9%, and Amazon trading lower by 2%. Bottom line here, a lot of selling. The Dow just turning negative right now. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down now by 6. S&P, to put it all in context, down by 1.1%. Balance of Power continues. Another busy day in Washington. Back we go once again. Your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
A busy day in Washington, indeed. Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. Of course, Washington is where you'll find myself, Kaylee Lines, and Joe Matthew today. Where you'll find the vice president, at least later on today, is in the key swing state of Georgia. She's getting set to hold a rally in Atlanta, a rally in which, by the way, the rapper Megan Thee Stallion will be attending. She, of course, is courting certain demographics with this trip today, and she's also trying to build her profile across many of these swing states with some ads, a $50 million ad buy to be exact, that tell a little bit more about her story. Here's a taste.
The one thing Kamala Harris has always been: fearless. As a prosecutor, she put murderers and abusers behind bars. As California's Attorney General, she went after the big banks and won $20 billion for homeowners. And as vice president, she took on the big drug companies to cap the cost of insulin for seniors.
Just a taste of that first ad, and to Kaylee's point earlier, it's backed by $12 million at least to start. Rather, that was the Trump ad buy. This one had a $50 million backing, so it's going to be everywhere. If you're living in a swing state, you're not going to be able to hide from that. We'll give you a taste of the new Trump ad, which clearly paints a different picture of Kamala Harris. But we start our conversation now with Michelle Jamrisco, Bloomberg's senior reporter and White House editor, with her view on the campaign. Michelle, it's great to see you as we turn our attention to Georgia, interestingly. This narrative of Republicans expanding the map, remember J.D. Vance in Virginia, Donald Trump in New York, seems to have been replaced by Democrats hoping to expand theirs.
Yeah, it's really been turned on its head, because we saw, from the Biden campaign, they were really obsessed with those sort of blue wall states, the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania triumvirate. And now we're looking at a very different triumvirate. They're expanding into Georgia, maybe Nevada, Arizona. So looking at some of those Sun Belt states. And part of that is what you all were talking about earlier, kind of appealing to new voting blocs that have already shown rampant support for Kamala Harris, namely women voters, younger voters, and people of color. So today, Atlanta being a very strong voting bloc center for people of color especially, this is a fitting coming out party site for Kamala Harris. This is the first earnest rally that she'll have as campaigning for president.
Well, it's interesting to consider her efforts in the Sun Belt, because in Georgia specifically, there is no potential vice presidential candidate from Georgia that we understand she's considering. We thought she was considering another Sun Belt state governor in Roy Cooper. He took himself out of the running in a statement last night. So that just leaves Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, if she's targeting those states in particular.
Yeah, that's really keeping us on edge. Are they going to play the VP card to a battleground, a map expansion play, or is it going to be someone who just gets along with her well, or just feeds into some sort of personality dynamic, or fills another gap that they believe that they might have? And that's really up in the air. That's keeping us on edge for the next several days.
Yeah, it's an interesting attempt here to begin identifying the candidate, which obviously, coming off of Trump-Biden, everyone knew everything or thought they did about both of them. This is an opportunity now to frame Kamala Harris in a slightly different light. The Trump campaign is going to work overtime to keep her from doing that. But what does this new sort of biographical approach tell us about the messaging we'll hear in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I think you're consistently hearing, if there's one thing, the whole prosecutor versus felon dynamic. I mean, as you played the ad, of course, it's called Fearless. They're leaning into this idea of Kamala Harris as a fighter, not just as a fighter in her prosecutorial past as Attorney General of California, but also, she wants to kind of inherit what the Biden campaign constantly talked about, is I'm a fighter for you, I'm a fighter for the middle class, I'm a fighter for the workers, all these constituencies that they're trying to kind of shore up, including in the blue wall states, but also in others, and then show that, as they call it, the split screen, the starkly different vision that the Trump campaign might have. So it's interesting to me, though, when we talk about going to Atlanta, this is a battleground that, Trump and Vance are going to visit this weekend. And again, with key voting blocs in the forefront, you talk about appeals to black voters. Trump is also going to speak to the National Association of Black Journalists this week. I mean, he's clearly trying to compete for the same voting blocs that Kamala Harris is seizing on as she becomes the presidential nominee.
Well, and we talk about competing. Obviously, they'll be competing for airtime as well, which is why these major ad buys are so crucial. Considering the fundraising figures, we've seen the Harris campaign put up already more than $200 million compared to our knowledge of what the Trump campaign is working with. What does that suggest about the way in which we'll be seeing money be spent in some of these key media markets?
They're really papering the airways. I mean, we saw it from the Biden campaign as well, even though they were kind of, depleting cash towards the end of that and leading up to the Biden dropout. So we'll have to see how these play. I mean, there's certainly, it was not lost on us that the audiences that they're targeting in the battleground states, but you'll see these ads if you're watching the Olympics, you'll see these ads if you're watching Bachelorette or The Daily Show, some of the biggest, shows on television. So they're clearly just trying to get eyeballs on who is Kamala Harris and how do they want to define her, because we're still in that early stage of introducing her.
All right, Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisco, thank you so much as we keep track of the millions of dollars that are being spent in advertising. There's other stories we're keeping track of as well, though, including escalating tension, at least in the Middle East, in the aftermath of a rocket attack that killed 12 young people in an Israeli-occupied territory over the weekend, and a vow from Israel, at least the Prime Minister Netanyahu, to respond in a harsh way. We now have a red headline crossing the terminal that Israel has struck near Hezbollah's Shura Council in Beirut. This is according to the National News Agency of Lebanon. This is a story we will continue to follow. The IDF spokesperson saying that the IDF targeted in Beirut the commander responsible for the murder of those children in that rocket attack this weekend, Joe.
Yeah, this is something we spent quite a bit of time on yesterday, wondering the extent to which Benjamin Netanyahu would choose to respond. We're getting a bit of a sense of this now, but it's just unfolding as we speak here, and we'll keep you posted over the course of this hour here on Balance of Power as we survey the landscape in this presidential campaign as the ad wars begin. We gave you a taste of the Kamala Harris ad that just started running today, a biographical ad, an attempt to introduce her all over again to the nation. Donald Trump wants to remind everyone of Kamala Harris's record in his ad that's now up in 6 swing states. Here's a taste of that one.
This is America's border czar, and she's failed us. Under Harris, over 10 million illegally here. 250,000 Americans dead from fentanyl. Brutal migrant crimes. And ISIS now here.
So let's consider more the states in which this border message may resonate most clearly, including states like Arizona, a state that our next guest knows quite well. John Seaton is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. He's founding partner and CEO at Echo Canyon Consulting and a Republican strategist. John, great to see you here in Washington. Thank you for being with us. We, of course, want to talk to you about the Arizona congressional primaries that are happening today as well. But if we could first begin with the landscape in what is a battleground state with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, knowing that Harris does have this perceived weakness on the border. How does that play on the ground in Arizona?
It's a huge deal in Arizona. Every single survey that you see, the number one issue, not just for Republican primary voters, but really for general election voters as well, is the border. It's an out of control, perceived as an out of control crisis. It's top of mind for voters, whether you are in southern Arizona, right near the border in Yuma, or up in Maricopa County, where the bulk of the vote is. Voters are very concerned with what's going on down at the southern border.
How do voters in Arizona then associate Senator Kelly with this issue? Because there's been a narrative that, hey, she could pick Kelly and maybe pick up Arizona. He could run defense for her on the border. Or are they criticizing him on this issue? Where does he stand in Arizonans' minds?
So far, I think Senator Kelly has actually done a very good job kind of staying out of the border controversy, if you will. I think part of it is having Democrats in the White House. A lot of the attention is focused on them. Sure. Senator Kelly happens to be the most popular politician in Arizona right now. So as Kamala Harris is taking a look at him, I definitely think he could be seen as an asset to her ticket.
Well, if she were to choose him as her vice presidential nominee, does that make Arizona borderline unwinnable for Trump? Just how does that change the dynamics?
He still has a very, very strong base in Arizona, especially in some of the rural areas, and even in some of the exurban, further away from Phoenix and Maricopa County, he still has a huge amount of support. So I expect Arizona to be very close. It'll be a battleground state, especially if she does pick Senator Kelly.
Well, he has such a strong base that he's made 2 endorsements in the same race. And I'm really confused on this. Arizona's 8th congressional district, we thought Blake Masters had can you explain to me how you get 2 endorsements in the same race? So basically Donald Trump is saying in the 8th congressional district, vote your conscience because both options are great.
So in 2022, he endorsed both men in separate races.
Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Hamadeh in the Attorney General race and Blake Masters in the U.S. Senate race. He got in very early for Abe Hamadeh in this congressional district race. But Blake Masters hasn't taken his foot off the gas, not just touting his support of what he calls the America First agenda, but also really strongly trying to court Trump supporters and the former president himself. And so over the weekend, Donald Trump did say, hey, I still think that Abe Hamadeh is a great fighter for America First, but also take a look at Blake Masters. So it'll be very interesting as we head towards 7 o'clock and the polls close tonight.
Well, we should also consider that his vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, came out and endorsed Blake Masters prior to this. Peter Thiel likes him as well. Yeah. We know of the Thiel-Vance relationship, so maybe we want to consider those dynamics as well. So all that said, John, how do you think this goes down? Who do you think comes out ahead?
Well, keep in mind in Arizona, there's a huge number of people who vote early. And so probably about as many
So
as
too late
two-thirds of
for
the
Trump
votes.
to make a difference,
Already, so it may be a little bit late. I'm sure the Masters campaign would tell you, boy, we really wish this could have come out, a week, 2 weeks earlier. It's still not over. I just took a look at the numbers before we came on. About 3,000 votes have been cast thus far on Election Day in the 8th Congressional District. So there's still, several thousand votes yet to be cast, but a lot of those votes were already in the bank prior to the endorsement.
This got really ugly and personal attacks to some of the images that Blake Masters put out of Abe Hamadeh. What happens post election here, and how damaged is the loser's reputation going to be?
So it's a safe district, so whoever wins this primary will almost certainly be the next member of Congress in Arizona 8. But I think whoever finishes second will have a lot of repair work to do. These are both very young men with very, very strong political aspirations going forward. Only one of them is going to win. So yeah, there'll probably be some repair work that's needed, and it'll be interesting to see how that, what form that takes.
Well, and of course, that's not the only race that bears watching today. There's also the Senate Republican primary, in which we've been really casting this race in the general as Kari Lake versus Ruben Gallego. Sure. That is what everybody's expectation is. But Kari Lake still has to win this primary. By what margin does she need to win it, though, when it's considered her to be so much so the front runner?
I think most folks like me are looking at about the 60% number. That if she is under 60, that's probably a concern. I expect her to eclipse it, but there's a sizable chunk of Republicans who are still not fully comfortable with Kari Lake. Many, many more are enthusiastic supporters. So I think if you look at that 60% number, if she eclipses that number, I think that's a reasonable bar for her to.
She's up by 10 or 12 though here, right? She's in a pretty good position going into this election. Is that right?
Yeah, she's in the primary. Yes. She's strongly favored to win. Her opponent, Sheriff Mark Lamb, very good guy. Never really got any kind of momentum behind him, so I expect her to win comfortably. That's one that should be called pretty early.
So what do people have? What's the taste left in people's mouths in Arizona after that brutal governor's race, which she, I think, still claims was stolen, right?
I think that Republicans never really left her. Again, the majority of Republicans were with her in the general in 2022, and whether or not they believe that she actually won that race, they've stuck with her. Remember, she was also a very popular newscaster for over 20 years in Arizona, so she has a strong following, and I expect generally, as we say, people are going to put on their jerseys. Republicans are going to stick with her. Ruben Gallego is running a strong campaign, but is a very, very progressive member of Congress, so I expect at the end of the day, we'll be hearing about the border, we'll be hearing about inflation a lot more than we're hearing about whether or not Kari Lake actually won in 2022.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, something we've been talking about much more widely in states other than Arizona, but certainly inclusive of Arizona as well, is now that it's Kamala Harris who is going to be leading the Democratic ticket, what tail effects that may have down the ballot. Do the odds look better for Ruben Gallego than they would have otherwise if it was still Joe Biden who was the Democratic nominee?
What I think you're seeing in Arizona and really in a lot of other swing states is just a lot more enthusiasm from Democrats more recently. I think some of that may be that this is still very new. It's just less than 2 weeks old since Kamala Harris became the de facto nominee. But I really think that you're seeing more enthusiasm. And while every vote still only counts the same, it does mean that these are people maybe more likely to go knock on doors, make phone calls, pound in yard signs, things of that nature. And in a close race, every little bit like that makes a difference.
As a Republican, we were talking to you in Milwaukee about the pick of J.D. Vance. Do you care about who Kamala Harris picks for running mate?
I think it's a big story for a few days. You need somebody who is going to be an articulate kind of messenger for your vision as the nominee, someone who maybe can be helpful in some of those swing states, someone who voters believe can actually do the job of president if, God forbid, anything were to happen to the president. And so I think that's what she'll be looking at. Maybe marginal difference if a Mark Kelly gets picked or a Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania. But at the end of the day, I think most voters really look at who's at the top of the ticket.
He's the founding partner, CEO at Echo Canyon Consulting. Longtime Republican strategist John Seaton with us here at the table. Great to pick your brain for a little while, John. Thank you so much for joining us on Arizona primary day, no less. I guess we'll be picking through results around this time tomorrow.
Indeed, we will. Hard to believe we're still in the middle of primary season. Yeah. But I guess everything has been constantly changing in this entire electoral cycle, and congressional races are no exception.
Well, we'll see if the Trump-endorsed candidate wins or the Trump-endorsed candidate. That will be the contest tonight, literally, we make our way through this.
He basically gets to commend his record on endorsements either way, right?
He's a winner either way, amazingly. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. It's the fastest show in politics on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll assemble our panel next. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano on the way with the latest on the campaign. This is Bloomberg.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We begin with a developing story and an update on the Middle East. Israel's military has struck Beirut suburbs, aiming at a Hezbollah commander in response to a rocket attack on Saturday in the Golan Heights that killed 12 people. Now, the Israel Defense Forces says it targeted, quote, the commander responsible for the murder of the children in Majd al-Shams and the killing of numerous additional Israeli civilians. Again, developing story. These headlines breaking right now. Bloomberg Television and Radio will have more coming up. It is a mixed day for the U.S. stock market. We got a sell-off in the world's biggest tech companies, sending stocks down. S&P now lower by 42, down 0.8%. NASDAQ is down 270, a decline there of 0.6%. The 10-year, 4.14%. The 2-year yield, 4.35%. Gold up $22 the ounce to $24.06, up 0.9%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.3%, $74.86 for a barrel of WTI. Sprouts Farmers Market shares are surging after the natural and organic food retailer boosted its full-year projections for comparable sales and profit. And a mass food poisoning outbreak at the office of TikTok parent company ByteDance in Singapore has led to the hospitalization of nearly 60 people, according to local media. Again, recapping U.S. stocks trading mix, the Dow holding on to a gain of 0.2%, S&P down by 0.8. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. In Washington, both Joe and myself are paying attention to what's happening abroad as well. Charlie just mentioned the headlines. I will repeat them for you. Israel saying that it has struck targets in Beirut, specifically targeting a Hezbollah commander in response to the rocket attack that killed 12 young people in the Israel-occupied Golan Heights this weekend. The Israeli Defense Forces saying that it targeted the commander responsible for the murder of those children, and goes on to say the killing of numerous additional Israeli civilians. The Israeli defense minister saying that Hezbollah crossed a red line. Of course, there has been a lot of concern, including concern from the U.S. about the way in which tensions may escalate between Israel and Hezbollah, and if that could engulf the Middle East in wider conflict, Joe. But I guess we'll see what reaction is from the international community as to whether or not this was an escalatory or proportionate response from Israel.
Well, that's been the question more than once when it comes to Israel in its war with Hamas, its retaliation against Iran, which this invokes, by the way. There are questions about to what extent Iran would be involved in a conflict involving Hezbollah and to what extent the U.S. would be at Israel's side. So this is just breaking. To Kaylee's point, it's important to note this first emerged from state-run media in Beirut, but we have heard from the IDF on this, and that statement is what brings this to a red headline on the terminal, Kaylee.
Yeah, and we'll have more coming up in just a few minutes with Natasha Hall. She is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East program. And of course, we have to consider how foreign policy is impacting the presidential race as well, and to what extent specifically Vice President Kamala Harris is attached to or can remove herself from the Middle East policy of the Biden administration.
We heard yesterday from John Kirby. Remember, there's no sunlight between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris when it comes to Israel policy. Let's assemble our panel for their take on this and a lot more with our eyes on the campaign trail. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis join us, Bloomberg Politics contributors here on Balance of Power. Jeannie, of course, political science professor at Iona University. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie, I wonder your thoughts at a moment like this with headlines like these and some of the concerns that we have heard from moderates, conservative-leaning voters who might consider a Kamala Harris when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to foreign policy and where she's going to land on an issue like Israel. How should they interpret that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are still waiting to hear. You're right. She has been described as having no sunlight between her and Joe Biden on this issue. Knowing how Kamala Harris has comported herself over the last several years, I don't suspect she will jump out ahead in any way of the president as it pertains to an issue as divisive as this. But this is, something that we all as Americans have long feared, an escalation. And that's why this breaking news is just it's not surprising, but it is very, very concerning and should be to all Americans and, of course, everybody in the Middle East.
Rick, we were speaking earlier this hour about the ad buy we've seen from the Trump campaign, specifically targeting Kamala Harris and her record on the border and immigration. Is there room as well for Trump and Republicans to attack her on foreign policy?
It's not that big a gap, to exploit as it is in immigration and on the economy, which is, by the way, another very important issue, especially in the swing states. With the war in the Middle East, I would say it's the lower 10 issues on most voters' minds. So investing in that, I think, is a low rate of return when it comes to politics. That being said, I think the onus is more on Harris to define herself when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, there is a question mark on what kind of commander-in-chief she would make. We know Joe Biden, we know Donald Trump, and I think that it's up to Harris now to actually find opportunities like this to make a statement in regards to how she sees things. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. Israel is a democracy. Hezbollah lobbed a missile that killed, a dozen children in Israeli territory. This is unacceptable. I think she can frame it in such a way that doesn't get her out of her comfort level in discussing the Middle East affairs, but also makes her look like she, in addition to being a prosecutor and attorney general, can actually command the troops.
Well, Rick just said a lot, Jeannie. How strong does Kamala Harris need to speak to this when she is at the podium today in Georgia?
I think she's going to need to speak to this, and she did last week, and I think she will do it again. She did last week after she met with Benjamin Netanyahu. But again, I think she is going to have to walk a fine line. She's got to be very careful that she doesn't get in the way of Joe Biden and the administration. She is on the campaign trail. They are in office. But I do think she needs to clarify where she stands, and I think she will, and she will repeat what she said last year. One thing to just add to that, as it pertains to her VP pick, there is a way in which fast-moving events can change things. And I'm not saying this event would, but should she look for somebody with stronger foreign policy chops than she may bring to the table? The short list doesn't contain many people, at least as far as we know, in that grouping. But there has been some quiet talk about that being something of a less than a weakness, if you can say, of hers. She is the sitting vice president, but should she look in that direction is something that, may be simmering underneath if these events, continue to escalate and blossom.
Well, Rick, let's expand on Jeannie's point here, how the vice president could potentially supplement or complement her on foreign policy. Who is best qualified for that? Is it Senator Mark Kelly as a veteran?
Oh, yeah. Well, not just a veteran, but Senator Mark Kelly has been serving on the Armed Services Committee in the Senate and has a long record. He was a former fighter pilot. We know astronaut. Certainly within the group that the media is reporting is her shortlist, he has substantially more robust credentials on foreign policy, national security, and intelligence than any other of the candidates. And look, we are in a dangerous world. It will be a topic at some point in this campaign. There is a potential for an October surprise because we see them happen more frequently these days. And so, I think that if you are concerned about her when it comes to national security issues, having someone like Mark Kelly on the ticket really goes a long way to allaying those concerns.
Well, it's really interesting the way news can impact the way we look at things here, Jeannie. It was all about Shapiro and Pennsylvania in our last hour when we were talking about the Veep stakes. Then these headlines hit. Could this impact her decision on a running mate?
I don't think at this point, but it could if events continue to escalate. I would note that we have heard that one person, in addition to Governor Cooper, who took themselves out of the running was Admiral McRaven. And he is somebody just like, different, but similar to, as Rick was describing, the senator from Arizona, who obviously has a background in foreign policy, in the military, being an admiral, a former commander of the special operations. But we understand he took himself out of consideration. If that reporting is true, you wonder, does somebody else of his type get put back in that, short list that we keep hearing about? So to your point, again, these events can change the way that we all look at things. And by the way, we should just mention J.D. Vance was chosen. And of course, he does have a military background. He was in the Senate. He is in the Senate briefly, but does he have the foreign policy chops that Republicans are looking for is another question to be raised.
Well, Jeannie, obviously we're looking at this right now through the lens of the people who are competing to be president. We do have a president right now. His name is Joe Biden, and he may be a one-termer, but he is still technically in charge here. He is the commander-in-chief. To what extent, Jeannie, is Joe Biden still going to be able to influence what happens in the Middle East, to advise Israel, and to the extent to which it should retaliate or not? Or has his power to do so greatly diminished because of his decision not to seek a second term?
You know, it's difficult being a lame duck. I think we saw that live last week when Netanyahu not only visited the president, but the vice president and also his opponent, Donald Trump. So, you know, that is the reality. It is more difficult for him, being Joe Biden, to command the attention that he did just a week ago. It is more difficult for him to sort of put out a profile there as to what he expects and to have the energy and support of Congress potentially to do what he needs to do. But that said, he is still the sitting president, and his words do have weight. And so I think, you know, the question is going to be how much is he supported by the vice president in this? I think it'll be a lot. And of course, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, who may remain very strong on this, not to mention the CIA director.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel with us today on Balance of Power. Many thanks for the insights here with breaking news. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. If you are just joining us here on Bloomberg TV, radio, or on YouTube, Israeli officials now confirming the fact that there has been a retaliatory strike against Hezbollah in the suburbs of Beirut. We're looking at 3 rockets here, Kaylee, following the rocket attack on the soccer field in the Golan Heights that claimed the lives of 12 young people. This is just breaking now. It's something just emerging this hour. So we want to be careful with the limited amount of information we have, but a great opportunity to bring in the voice of an expert. We're joined by Natasha Hall, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East Program. Natasha, it's good to see you. Thank you for joining us here today on Bloomberg.
Thanks for having me.
There was a question about what the response would be. Does this seem proportionate in the outset?
So I would say that I was speaking to diplomats just a bit earlier than this, and there had been some evacuation of the Dahia, or this suburban area of Beirut that is also a Hezbollah stronghold. So many people in the area knew that this might be the targeted area and had been evacuating for some time. That said, we should still be aware of the civilian casualties that might be at play, because this is a neighborhood after all. But I would say that this was something that was to be expected.
And of course, there is a lot we don't know, including what casualties may have resulted from this. We just know that Israel was targeting a Hezbollah commander, but of course we know that Israel often targets specific people, and there is more collateral damage that comes with it. We just had a headline from N12 TV citing an Israeli official saying that they are not looking to start a regional war. Does that just depend, though, on the response that Hezbollah may deliver to this? Israel has made its move.
I would say that for Hezbollah and for Israel, a regional escalation is not in the cards, or at least they don't want it to be in the cards. That said, there could always be an escalation, essentially by accident, which is essentially what happened with the Majlis Shams attack that you mentioned that killed 12 young people so recently. This was a mistake, essentially. It seems like it was a strike that was a mistake. And so it's just something like that, just any kind of spark that could lead to a wider conflagration, and that's what we're all very, very worried about. Right now, I think Joe Biden and others within the administration are working very, very hard not to see that regional escalation, because that would essentially mean a two-front war for Israel as well.
What is Iran telling Hezbollah right now?
I would say that Iran also does not want much of an escalation at this point. It is getting major political points within the region, and I would say in the world, for everything that the Israeli officials are doing pretty much on their own within Israel in terms of what's the horrific humanitarian catastrophe going on in Gaza right now, but also what's going on within Israel in terms of the political turmoil there. So it doesn't seem to me that Iran would really need to do much to damage Israel's standing any any further.
So if this is a matter of incentives to not escalate further, whose incentive is greater to be holding back here? Is it Israel or Iran and its proxies?
So that's a good question. So you're saying Israel, but really what we're talking about is a handful of Israeli politicians.
The Netanyahu government.
Right, the Netanyahu government, which I think is different than necessarily what the interests of Israelis or Israel would be. And that's concerning, and that's been concerning for U.S. officials for some time, that Netanyahu might prolong a war, even expand a war so that he could maintain control within the government. That said, I think the Iranian officials will probably try to mitigate the larger consequences of this war, but also use all of the internal turmoil that's going on in Israel and what's going on in Gaza to really build up more political points here. That said, you're poking the bear being Hezbollah, and there might have to be other retaliatory strikes depending on the extent of the attacks that we've just been talking about.
Well, that's a great point, that we might not be done here,
right.
Which is why we do want to be cautious with our analysis in the early going. But what does this mean for Hamas? What does this mean for Gaza at this point as everyone turns their attention to something potentially more in the north? There's much to be resolved still. We've broken down our temporary pier. They're still struggling to get humanitarian aid into an area that you just qualified as a humanitarian crisis.
What is happening right now in Gaza is horrific, and we've just heard reporting just last week that there's been evidence that polio might be spreading within Gaza as well, which should be terrifying not just for Palestinians but for the larger region as well. Speaking of regional escalation, this would have been the moment that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and the administration could have potentially used to increase humanitarian aid and access into Gaza to mitigate a larger escalation, actually, an epidemic in a sense. We haven't seen that yet, but that needs to happen. There needs to be a ceasefire in order for actual proper response to this, potential threat to Israel as well. But we have not seen that yet because there's been a lot of other distractions in the north, but also within Israel itself. And so it's unclear after Netanyahu's speech last week in Congress whether there will be a ceasefire deal.
Well, and we know that negotiators were working on that in recent days. They were meeting in Rome. We heard from the Prime Minister's office, Netanyahu's that is, that Hamas was changing some of its demands. What do you think the real prospect is of a ceasefire agreement, temporary or otherwise, being reached in the near term when they have been trying at this effort for months now?
Right. I mean, and we were seriously talking about a ceasefire deal in February, and we're 10 months in at this point now. I think that it really depends on how much pressure is applied by external elements like the United States or Iran on the warring parties at this point. There was a recent poll actually in Israel that Israelis are primarily blaming Netanyahu more than even Hamas for the lack of a hostage deal at this point. There's a great deal of frustration with Netanyahu on delivering the hostages at this point. And so that could be the political pressure that's needed for Netanyahu to get a plan. Also, Kamala Harris's speech last week was very powerful in the sense that she made it known that it was time for a deal to happen. And so I think that if there is mounting pressure, especially from the north now as well, also within Israel, that Israel might need to decide to take it down a notch in other areas that could potentially be Gaza and aim for some kind of ceasefire. But it might be too early to tell.
Well, it's great to have you with us. Natasha Hall, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East Program. A great moment to have you with us here. Unfortunately, not the best news today. We'd like to stay in touch with you on this as we learn more.
Thank you so much.
I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Kaylee, that ceasefire is something that remains elusive, but something that we will continue to talk about as long as it remains possible. We've got an important conversation ahead with Senator Marsha Blackburn, who's been awfully busy today.
Yeah, we have a lot to pay attention to here in Washington. The Senate is still in town, and we're voting today. on the Kids Online Safety Act. So we'll have much more on that coming up. But first, let's get a check on the market action. Charlie Pellet has a look up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Kaylee Lyons. Indeed, a very mixed market right now with the Dow Jones Industrial Average holding on to a gain of 0.2%. However, we have got the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index all in the red. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares is holding on to a gain of just under 0.1%. But the S&P right now down 38, a drop there of 0.7%. Dow Industrials up 91, a gain of 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 250 points, a wave of tech selling lower by 1.4%. 10-year yield right now at 4.14% with a 2-year 4.35%. Spot gold up $21 the ounce, up 0.9%. 24.05, while West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.1%, 75 even a barrel on WTI. The big event after the close of trading today, Microsoft earnings. Complete coverage on Bloomberg Television and Radio ahead of that report. Microsoft down now by 1.9%. It will be the first of 4 mega cap tech names reporting this week. Meta Platforms out tomorrow, down 0.7% right now. Apple and Amazon Thursday. Apple down 0.5%. Amazon down 1.3%. Also, cannot ignore Advanced Micro Devices and 2 reports after the close of trading again today. So Microsoft down 1.8%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Very busy day. And once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
Charlie Pellet, thank you as ever, keeping tabs on the markets for us here on the fastest show in politics. Thanks for joining here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Indeed, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington, where, Kaylee, things are happening today. The House may be gone, but the Senate has actually been busy. There are a couple of important things taking place today. One of them brings us back to the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. An important hearing today, a joint hearing, the Senate Judiciary and Homeland Security hearings with the new boss, the acting Secret Service Director Ron Rowe. And also an important vote, Kaylee, as the Senate passes legislation to protect kids online. We've talked about this quite a bit, for instance, with Senator Marsha Blackburn. Unclear where this goes in the House, but this is the first time, really, that lawmakers have managed to get their arms around this.
Yeah, and in a bipartisan way, the vote was 91-3. To approve this measure, which will essentially impose sweeping safety and privacy requirements for children and teenagers on social media platforms. So clearly a bipartisan effort. It will now get sent to the House, where, of course, they don't actually return to Washington until September 9th, and we'll quickly be talking about a funding fight to avoid a government shutdown after the fiscal year expires on September 30th. So let's talk about the realistic prospects for the specific legislation and bring in one of its supporters. As Joe mentioned, the Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee is with us now from Capitol Hill. Senator, thank you so much and welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm sure you're pleased with the results of this vote in the Senate today. Have you had discussions with your colleagues in the House about what its future may be in the other chamber?
Yes, indeed. I have had those discussions. We have bipartisan leaders in the House and broad bipartisan support. You have Congresswoman Castor, Congressman Bilirakis, and they're the leads in the House. And there is broad bipartisan support across the body of the House for pushing this forward. I think that you will see House leadership move it to the floor for a vote, and we will get this to the president's desk. The reason for that is there has been an unbelievable coalition of parents and school principals and educators and pediatricians and kids that have said there need to be protections in the virtual space so that we are not subjected to some of these algorithmic rabbit trails that kids end up on when they are in the virtual space. And you know, it's so interesting. Parents and kids alike have realized when you're online, you are the product. And the longer they keep you online, the more scrolling you do, the richer that data is, the more money they make. And that is why these social media companies, even though they've known what they were doing was addictive and was causing harm, they've continued to do it. They have put profits before our children.
Algorithmic rabbit trails. I like that, Senator. I remember distinctly on the 31st of January, and I know you do too, a remarkable moment in which Mark Zuckerberg was invited to, and he did stand up in a Judiciary Committee hearing, turn around and apologize to some of the folks who were there. Quote, "It's terrible," he said. "No one should have to go through the things that your families have suffered," as Josh Hawley pressed him about whether he would apologize directly to parents. Right. How does this legislation prevent other parents from ending up in that world?
Yes, what the legislation does is safety by design. This is a product design piece of legislation. Just as we have consumer protections in many products, this is putting those protections in place in the virtual space. It requires a duty of care. There's a toolbox for kids and parents. It opens the algorithmic black boxes. It has a portal to report bad actors in the virtual space. And then the social media platforms have to block or remove those bad actors. As we know, pedophiles, drug dealers, human traffickers, sex traffickers, cyber bullies are all utilizing this space to harm children. And in the physical world, you can't sell tobacco and alcohol or pornography to a child. You can't take them into a strip club. And people would say, why are there not protections in the virtual space? Because our children are exposed to this 24/7, 365. And this is that first step, and we look forward to the House quickly taking action and sending it to the President for signature.
Senator, we have seen when it comes to social media companies and the moderation of content, whomever that content is targeted towards, has raised some First Amendment questions. We've seen this in legal challenges that have gone all the way to the Supreme Court in its most recent term. Do you expect there to be any First Amendment issues with this piece of legislation that these social media companies may use to fight it?
This is not a speech bill. It is not a content bill. This is a product design bill. And we feel good about the placement. We have worked for over 3 years with stakeholders. We have worked with parents. We've worked with physicians and pediatricians. And no, I feel very good about where we have this legislation.
Senator Blackburn, we saw you in Milwaukee confronting the now former director of the Secret Service. Kimberly Cheadle has resigned her post following the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. I know you had some very stern words for her captured on video. Our viewers on Bloomberg TV can see you essentially chasing her down the hall with a piece of your mind. You had a chance today to talk with at least her temporary replacement, the acting Secret Service Director, Ron Rowe, who was there with the Deputy FBI Director, talking about the cleanup here, essentially. Senator, did you hear what you needed to hear to believe, to have faith that the Secret Service can correct the mistakes that led to this?
What we were today, Director Rowe described himself as a change agent. I think we will see how he is going to execute that change. I did ask him about the whistleblower email that was released and made public today, where the whistleblower says, you know, it's a CYA. That is the mission at the Secret Service. Everybody's practicing that. And Director Rowe has been a career guy. He's been there for 25 years. We will see if he is actually able to do some change and restore some trust and some faith. And I asked him if he was going to allow these whistleblowers who are complaining about the culture that has developed there at the Secret Service to come forward and tell their story and to work with us as we try to make certain the Secret Service is able to do their job. They obviously did not do their job in Butler, Pennsylvania. And then also concerns with the FBI. And Deputy Director Abate was with us. I questioned him on the social media accounts. There had been some confusion around that, a little bit of contradiction coming from the FBI. There's an account when Crooks was younger, And then there is the Gab account that takes us up closer to the time that he carried out the assassination attempt. But how in the world they expect people to have trust in the FBI when former President Trump was allowed by the Secret Service to take the stage at 6 o'clock, when at 5:51 they knew they had a potential threat within range of him in that outer perimeter. It is just unbelievable. And how could they leave a water tower unattended? And the Secret Service has 31 individuals, former presidents, current president, vice president, families, and some others that have received death threats, a total of 31 people. These individuals need to know that the Secret Service is there to protect their lives and that they're going to be well tended. And as you saw in the hearing, there is much agreement on a bipartisan basis about how the Secret Service has moved forward in recent months.
Well, certainly, Senator, between that hearing and the votes today, it's been a busy day in your chamber, and your work is not yet done for the week. We understand on Thursday, you'll have a chance to vote for a tax deal that passed the House with a massive bipartisan majority, in part tax breaks for businesses with an extension of the child tax credit. Considering you were just talking to us about protecting children in the online space, will you pass up the opportunity to potentially protect some of them from poverty?
And what we want to do is make certain that we get this bill right. This bill has some serious flaws, and I think what you will do is see, I don't think they'll get 60 votes to move forward with this. There are issues with this bill, and let's get it right. Let's make those tax cuts permanent with that R&D tax credit. And then, of course, we've got opportunity zones, new market credits, work opportunity credits. We are far from ready to move forward with that bill.
Senator, we've only got about a minute left here. I don't want to set you up to cut you off, but I have to ask you about Israel's response to Hezbollah. You said last weekend, quote, "We must stand with Israel following the attack that claimed the lives of 12 young people." We now have seen at least the initial response with the rocket attack against an area in the suburbs of Beirut. Is that appropriate from your view?
You know, I want to make certain that Israel has what they need to protect themselves, and we also know that Iran is the main sponsor of terrorism globally. We know what they have done to fund, to equip, to train Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, ISIS in Iraq. And I think it would be appropriate for President Biden to step forward and put those sanctions President Trump had on Iran, put the sanctions back on so they are not able to sell their oil on the global stage.
Are you concerned that this is a proportionate attack, though, or response, I should say, Senator? Do you think Israel should do more to make a point to stop Hezbollah?
I want to make certain that Israel can defend itself. As you mentioned earlier, we've had a busy day. I have not looked at any of the detail around the attack. I learned about that from you all.
Understood. Well, it's kind of you to spend some time with us. As always, Senator Marsha Blackburn, the Republican from Tennessee, with a big vote today, a remarkable vote, as a matter of fact, Kaylee. It's not often we see numbers like this these days on Capitol Hill. We'll see what happens in the House.
Yeah, of course, we'll have to wait several weeks for that to come to fruition, as summer recess is already underway for the House, not yet for the Senate, though we'll be there by the end of this week. And of course, much still coming up this week and today as we look ahead to Kamala Harris's trip to Atlanta, Georgia, a critical swing state, as she continues her still nascent presidential campaign.
We'll be following her on the trail and have the latest on the Veep stakes and, of course, the latest in Israel coming up in the later edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Washington time here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek, and let's get to the setup on this. It's kind of a Fed Tuesday. We'll get to that in just a moment. It is July 30th. It is a big week, though, for earnings as several of the Magnificent Seven do report. We do have that Fed decision tomorrow, and then we've got some headlines continuing out of the Middle East.
Yeah, this is Israel's military struck Beirut, aiming at a Hezbollah leader in response to a rocket attack on Saturday in the Golan Heights that killed 12 young people. We have live footage coming out of Beirut from the Associated Press. We'll show you that in just a minute. Also coming up, Carol, that Fed decision. We got some thoughts ahead of that.
We do indeed. Is it really just about the September meeting, not tomorrow's decision? And maybe is it about Jackson Hole, which is in August? So a lot to kind of dig into there. Plus, we've got, several members of the Mag 7 reporting this week, including tonight after the closing bell, Microsoft. So will the results kind of help turn the tide in what we've seen in a more than $2 trillion sell-off in the NASDAQ 100? So do we get some results from Microsoft later tonight, Tim, that kind of make people think a little bit differently, maybe not so negative on the AI trade?
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see just after 4 o'clock. Also coming up this hour, ahead of that, we got one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal on billionaire Ken Griffin spending millions to put his stamp on Donald Trump's GOP.
All right, first up, folks, let's get to the trade on this Tuesday. Let's turn things over to Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much, Carol Masser. Indeed, very busy Tuesday. Lots of moving parts to these markets. Got to keep it locked in to Bloomberg Television and Radio. Right to the numbers here. Here's where we stand. Dow Industrials holding on to a gain now of 123 points, up 0.3%. S&P 500 index down 32 now, drop there of 0.6%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 227, a decline right now of 1.3%. Tech selling off. The NASDAQ 100 index down 1.4%. But the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares higher now by 3 points, up by about 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.14% with a 2-year 4.35%. Gold now up $20 the ounce, 24.05, up 0.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down now by 1.1%, 74.98 a barrel. And Brent, the global benchmark, 78.78, down by 1.3%. Bottom line here, stocks getting hit by a sell-off in the world's largest tech companies ahead of key central bank decisions, bonds and gold climbing as traders rush for safety amid geopolitical risks. And of course, as Carol mentioned, all eyes on Microsoft after the close of trading, the first of 4 mega cap tech names reporting this week. Microsoft right now down 1.6%. Meta Platforms tomorrow down 0.5%. Apple and Amazon on Thursday. Apple now down by 0.3%. Amazon down 1.2%. Again, recapping, stocks lower. S&P now down 35, a drop of 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, that is your market setup on this Tuesday, July 30th. Let's get to some of that news out of the Middle East. Israel's military struck Beirut, aiming at a Hezbollah leader in response to a rocket attack that was over the weekend, Saturday specifically, in the Golan Heights that killed 12 young people. So let's get to it. Let's head to Tel Aviv. That's where we find Bloomberg News Israel Bureau Chief Ethan Bronner. Ethan, what do we know about the attack that just seemed to be moments ago?
Hi, Carol. Look, what you said is what we know. The name of the Hezbollah official appears to be Mohsen Shoker. The Israelis have not confirmed that, but that's coming out of Lebanon. The Israelis have confirmed to me that the person that they hit, and I don't know if the person is dead, is a very senior Hezbollah official. They argue that his elimination will be a major blow to Hezbollah, and they say further that they're not planning to escalate beyond this, and if there's escalation, it will be because of Hezbollah.
The retaliation in response to a rocket attack on Saturday in the Golan Heights that killed 12 young people. What do we know about that attack, Ethan?
Well, so Tim, that attack, that was Hezbollah. We're quite clear it was a 53 kilogram missile that hit the soccer field in which kids were playing. I mean, I don't think it's reasonable to assume that it was a purposeful hit. I think that they were aiming for an Israeli military position not far away, and failed. But 12 kids aged 10 to 16 were killed, and Israel has taken revenge or retaliation today for it. That's clear.
You know, the United States has come out agreeing with Israel that Hezbollah was culpable in terms of what the hit over the weekend, urging all sides to avoid any escalation. It feels like, though, that the two sides have been exchanging fire daily. It feels like escalation's already here.
Well, I mean, I think there's escalation. So there's been a slow, steady escalation for nearly 10 months, as you point out. I think the goal, at least on this side and probably on the other side, is for it not to devolve into a genuine war, which would bring in Iran and perhaps the United States and just be utterly destructive to both countries, certainly to Lebanon. The Israelis have been planning and studying targets in Lebanon for 15 or 16 years. I think the Hezbollah has 140 or 50,000 missiles that it can start shooting at the northern cities and even to Tel Aviv. And people would die in this country. There's no question about it. It would be a very devastating war. So both sides have the reasons to want to make their point and not enter an actual war.
You know, there's making points and there's escalation. I guess I don't always understand war because I feel like if there's a back and forth, even if they're targeting military sites, that to me says escalation. But help me understand the technicalities or specifics of war.
Look, we fortunately have grown up in a country and in an era with very little war on our homeland. So it is, in fact, a very foreign and very upsetting concept to us. In this part of the world, war is a little more part of the daily thrum and thrust of life. And war would mean that, I mean, right now, for example, the Israelis sent a drone and hit a building and killed a guy, they hope, or perhaps others, in the same way that a missile came into the Golan Heights on Saturday, though that kind of exchange is distinct from the armies heading toward one another and an actual war, right? There's a difference.
Ethan, what now could we expect to see from the United States and other allies to help prevent a wider scale regional conflict?
I mean, they've been on the phone with all these guys. Sorry to interrupt. They've been on the phone with all these guys, Tim, for since Saturday and really all along, because we have, of course, this is in the context of this war that Israel is fighting against Hamas in Gaza, nearly 10 months now. Hezbollah in Lebanon has been bombing Israel in solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza and say that when that war, or if there were to be a ceasefire, they would stop fighting. That has been the goal of the U.S. and the French and others for a long time, and the Egyptians and the Qataris. So there are negotiations going on for some kind of ceasefire in Gaza, and that would, in theory, calm the guns as well in Lebanon. And then there would be an attempt for a longer-term deal. That is what the Americans want. It's not clear if it's gettable.
Hey, I'm just thinking, it's just off of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking before that joint session of Congress. Just remind us, I always feel like we go back there, but I guess being here from the United States, kind of want to understand on the ground, what is the support still for the military actions in Israel and also the military actions that are being led by the Prime Minister?
They're pretty intensive support. The Prime Minister, as we know, is facing political difficulties. He's been indicted for corruption. It is felt that his insistence on a judicial overhaul last year caused his Hamas to feel the country was weak enough for this kind of attack. So there's a lot of anger toward Netanyahu, but not about the war per se. There is a growing sense that he needs to do more to bring the remaining hostages home. But generally, Israelis feel that what happened on October 7th, 2023 is a sign that militias paid for and armed and trained by Iran want to destroy this country, and Israel needs to fight back intensively, both in the north and in the south. Don't forget there are 60 to 80,000 inhabitants of the north who've been out of their homes for nearly 10 months because of the rocket fire from Hezbollah, and people want to go back to their homes, and people want to send a message to Israel's enemies that says, we're willing to fight. We have no other home.
And there's still a willingness of the citizens in Israel who are and have been taking up arms to continue to do that.
Very much so. There is. Of course, there is fatigue, but there is a sense here that this is an existential set of conflicts, north and south, and with Iran fundamentally, and it mustn't be abandoned until victory of some nature has appeared.
As we always say, stay safe, Ethan. Thank you so much. Bloomberg News Israel Bureau Chief Ethan Bronner joining us in Tel Aviv. Well, we do want to get back to the markets. There's a lot on investors' minds, including, of course, what's going on geopolitically and, of course, what's going on in the Middle East. Interesting story right through about history being on the side of stock and bond bulls as Fed officials kicked off that two-day policy meeting today. Equities and bonds have posted weekly gains amid 6 of the 8 Fed meetings over the past year. This, according to an analysis, Tim, by Citigroup.
And yet the devil always in the details, with the key points to focus on in tomorrow's Fed decision. Back with us, we have Stephen Skanke, Chief Economic Advisor at the wealth advisor Keel Point. Steve, also a former U.S. Treasury and White House National Security Council staff member, serving during the Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan administration. Steve joins us from Washington, D.C. Also here in the studio, Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist Stuart Paul. Stuart, good to have you here in the studio with us. I do want to start with you because the Fed is not expected to make any move tomorrow, but we do, or a lot of investors, I should say, expect to hear signals of perhaps a move come September. How do they thread that needle where they say, okay, we're not going to do anything in July, maybe we're not going to do anything, we're not going to do anything until September. How do you do that?
There are a few different ways that they could sort of gently modify the FOMC statement, the formal statement that comes out. For example, in the opening paragraph, there's a line, in recent months, there's been modest further progress towards the committee's 2% inflation target. Just stripping out the word modest, just there's been further progress would be one of those little gentle signs.
We said the devil was in the details, or one word.
That's right. They could be a bit more bold and say things that if the data evolves as the committee expects, it will soon be appropriate to begin cutting rates. That would be a much bolder, clearer call for a looming rate cut in September.
All right, I want to bring in Steve, and I'm just pulling it up on the Bloomberg. So September 8th is a long way off. I think about, Steve, we've made progress, a lot of progress in the past year when it comes to inflation. It seems to be settling down consistently. We continue to see U.S. economic growth. That's a good thing. We got some data today, consumer confidence rising on an improved outlook for the economy, job openings beating forecasts. It's this delicate balance. If you were still advising the White House, what would you be telling them about tomorrow's Fed decision?
Well, they just need to be patient and not seem anxious and not jump the gun on it. The Fed is navigating this very carefully and really very deftly. A week or so ago, the Fed chair, the New York Fed Bank president were all talking about the concern about what was happening in labor markets. And really signaling that they're eager to start cutting rates, but they really need to see good inflation numbers. And then lo and behold, they get a reprieve because we get better than disinflation numbers with the PCE deflator down at 2.5% for the last year, and then better than expected second quarter economic growth at 2.8% annualized. Even though when you dig into it, it's not quite as good as it looks, but economy is slowing, but not in the tank. Inflation is coming down, and even the hard to squeeze housing or shelter component of the CPI and PCE deflator has started to give up. But it had been trending at 6.5 to 7% inflation, and now it's at 4%.
So, Steve, would you be telling, if you were advising the White House right now, say, hey, listen, guys, go take that vacation. We got plenty of time. Just cut to the chase. Would you say that?
I certainly would say that, because anything that they could say, Carol, is not going to be helpful to the Fed doing what it really wants to do, and that is cutting rates in September. Now, they can applaud positive economic growth. They can applaud inflation coming down. But I would tell the folks in the White House to say absolutely nothing about the Fed meeting and what the Fed is doing.
And they're independent, of course. Carol, remember.
Who? The Fed?
The Fed is politically independent.
I've heard.
You've heard. Stuart, economic data that you have an eye on at Bloomberg Economics as U.S. economist, where are you starting to see concerns? Do you think the Fed is acting too slowly on these concerns?
I don't. So you might want to rewind the clock a little bit and think back to Q4 of 2023 when the inflation data were so good and everybody was expecting a rate cut to come in March. And so things can change pretty quickly. We have had
It's like when you have a little sibling and you psych them and you pull something away, or like,
Right.
psych. Not happening.
Is that speaking from experience, Carol?
Yeah, there's a lot of siblings who do that.
The data in the economic landscape can change relatively quickly, and where we've seen the most change so far has been in the loosening of the labor market. It was just in the June summary of economic projections that the Fed is expecting to end the year with 4.1% unemployment, and we're already there. And I think that odds are favoring us triggering the SOM rule, that real-time recession indicator, in August.
Remind us what that rule is.
So if the 3-month moving average of the unemployment rate exceeds the 12-month minimum by more than 50 basis points, by half a percentage point, it's typically a good indicator that a recession has already begun, that you're in the early innings of a recession. So we're expecting, not only are we expecting to not end the year at 4.1% unemployment, which is where we are and which is where the Fed expects to end the year, we think that we're going to trigger that real-time recession indicator before the September meeting, which would warrant that cut in September.
Is there a chance it's triggered on Friday?
Very low probability that it's triggered on Friday. We'd basically need to get a move to 4.2 and a half, right? So 4.25% unemployment. So a bit out of range. Consensus is expecting a 4.1% unemployment rate. We think that it's more likely going to be the case that it's going to be triggered in the August jobs report, which comes just a few days before the September meeting.
Well, I kept thinking, we had that inverted yield curve for so long. I mean, do we get off scot-free, that we don't ultimately get a recession? I mean, Steve Skanke, if we get a recession, is it touch and go because we have enough growth, or could it be something more dramatic and problematic?
Well, the thing about it, Carol, that's a very good question, is that these things are never linear. It's not that it just sort of eases into recession. Something triggers it and pushes it, and most likely it would be mild, just given everything else that's going on in the economy. But it isn't necessarily a mild recession. And so the Fed treads very carefully, and as Stuart said, this SOM rule, it's a statistical observation. It's not a syllogistic argument as to why it happens, but it has a good enough statistical basis that we really need to be careful about that and watch for it. The other thing is, and I agree with Stuart, it's very unlikely that we would see unemployment trigger up to what would be needed to trigger the SOM rule. But the household survey has been so quirky since COVID and the shutdown of the economy that, and it digresses so much from the employer survey that we could actually end up with something.
Right.
That pushes unemployment to 4.2 or 4.2 and a half.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we've got this phenomenon of, well, what does it mean? And of course, markets would go crazy while they try to figure that out.
Got it.
Stuart, 10 seconds. 175,000 is the number that economists are expecting with the jobs report on Friday. Does it come in above or below that?
We're a smidge above, but we see the downside risk to 175. The effects of Hurricane Beryl are likely showing up in the data. We've already seen it affect the unemployment insurance claims data just 2 weeks ago in Texas.
All right. There we go.
I said 10 seconds. He did it.
Love when people listen. Thank you so much. Steve Skanke, Chief Economic Advisor at Keelpoint, and of course, our own Stuart Hall, Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist. Coming up, well, we're going to continue to track the markets. We're also going to get to the latest from the campaign trail. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow holding on to a gain of 207 points now, up by 0.5%. Much of the market, though, being hit by a sell-off in the world's largest tech companies. We got the S&P down 22, a drop right now of 0.4%. NASDAQ down 181, lower by 1%. The NASDAQ 100 index down 1.1%. But the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares is up 0.3%. 10-year 4.14%, the 2-year 4.35%. Gold up 1%, 24.06 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.4%, 74.76 a barrel. CrowdStrike Holdings shares falling to their lowest since December, following a report that Delta Airlines has hired a prominent attorney following a technology outage that led the carrier to cancel thousands of flights. Delta shares, they're up 1.1%. Shares of CrowdStrike, though, down now by 10.8%. Coming up after the close of trading, we hear from Microsoft and Advanced Micro Devices. Right now, we've got Microsoft down 1.3%. Meta Platforms reports tomorrow, down 0.4%. Apple on Thursday, up 0.1%. Also Thursday, Amazon down now by 0.9%. Again, recapping, stocks lower. S&P down 25, down 0.5. 10-year yield 4.13%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. Well, Vice President Kamala Harris is kicking off a push to compete against Republican Donald Trump in a wider swath of battleground states with a rally today in Atlanta. Harris's event in Georgia's largest city is her first major effort to put a larger group of states back into play since launching her campaign back on July 21st.
Meantime, the presidential race is on. The money race, that is. Among our most read on the Bloomberg terminal today is an exclusive about hedge fund billionaire Ken Griffin, who's spending tens of millions of dollars to back Republican primary candidates across the U.S. The story reported by Bloomberg News national reporter Mike Smith and Bill Allison, Bloomberg News campaign finance reporter. Mike joins us from Miami. Bill in our D.C. bureau. Mike, I do want to start with you. How would you characterize the type of candidate that Griffin is giving to right now? Because there's a lot of nuance here.
Yeah, there is a lot of nuance, and it's not entirely clear exactly what he's looking for, but in general, it's sort of old school pro-business conservative values that he is backing, for example, national defense. And one of the main things he is promoting is sort of helping the American dream, which is obviously a very broad description, but that's how he describes it.
Does that backing, Mike, include Donald Trump at this point?
Well, so far, no. As far as we can see in the most recent filings in terms of money, he's yet to give money to Donald Trump. He hasn't ever given money to Donald Trump that we know of. And he's quite guarded in saying whether he's going to back Trump or not. He's certainly a Republican. He gives to Republican causes and candidates, but Trump is yet to be seen.
So, Bill, let's go through the money. What do we know about Ken Griffin and his donations to the GOP going back the last decade or so? What has he typically supported? How much has he given up? And where does it go? And what is he doing today?
Really, since 2016, he's focused on Congress. Both the Senate and the House. He's given, I think, $248 million since 2015, which is an awful lot of money, about $250 million. And he's focused largely on super PACs that, again, elect members of Congress. And in the last couple of cycles, he's really looked at early money and having an influence on primaries, like who gets chosen to get elected to Congress. Like he'll look at safe Republican districts. He'll put a lot of money in behind what he views as a superior candidate and try to get that person into Congress. And so far this cycle, he's put more than $75 million into political committees at the federal level.
Mike, how successful has he been over the last decade? Because it seems like he hasn't always bet on the right horse, so to speak. He supported the opponent to J.D. Vance in his Ohio Senate race who J.D. Vance ended up beating. He's thinking about supporting somebody who could challenge Matt Gaetz. He has supported Nikki Haley in the past, Kevin McCarthy in the past as well. How successful has he been?
Yeah, I mean, that's an elusive thing to answer, but we can say that this year, this cycle, he's gotten behind 60 different candidates in congressional races, and they've won about 2/3 of those, or a little bit more. So it's not a bad record. He has won a lot, but he's also lost some, and a lot of his money has gone into losing races, and a lot has gone into winning races.
And I do wonder too, Bill, we often kid, but it's very true. Money talks, right? And money gets attention. How influential has he been really in kind of shaping what's going on in the Republican Party? We talk so much about it being, Donald Trump's party right now. But how much has he really been influential over the GOP overall?
Well, the Republican operatives that we talk to, the people who run super PACs, the people who recruit candidates, the people who really kind of do that nuts and bolts work of running the party, say that he's fundamental to their success. He's very influential. He's very important. If you have an idea for a super PAC, you want to elect veterans, you want to elect women with business experience. There's a whole broad range of folks who do different kinds of super PACs. He's somebody who's definitely going to be on your list to try to get, at least to his advisors, to make your pitch, to say this is what my plan is, this is what I'd like to do. And, if he decides to fund you, you have a good chance of also drawing money from other donors.
Bill, somebody might read a story like this and come away with a really cynical view that, politicians can be, I'm not going to say they can be bought, but certainly people with power are able to donate a lot of money to super PACs that go around traditional campaign finance. Just give us some context as to how something like this is legal and how super PACs are able to operate in this world when certain individuals are only allowed to give a relatively small amount of money to individual candidates.
Boy, there's a famous saying in politics that, there are three important things in politics: money, and I forget what the other two are. And this has been kind of consistent throughout history. Super PACs are legal because of basically the First Amendment. The Supreme Court held that, if you're speaking independently, i.e. not donating to a politician, but donating to a group that tries to elect politicians, that's First Amendment protected activity. And that, in something called the Citizens United case, gave us these creatures, or these super PACs. And it is fairly important in U.S. politics that you be able to have there's three different kinds of donors. There's small dollar donors, which are very important, but you need millions and millions of them to add up to a lot of money. And then you have a handful of people. There's the folks in the middle, and you have the handful of people at the top who can, with one check, fund, a huge ad buys. We've seen already in this campaign an investor named Timothy Mellon who put $50 million into a super PAC backing Donald Trump. I mean, we've done stories that Elon Musk is thinking of putting $45 million into a super PAC each month to help Donald Trump with his ground game. So obviously, it's hugely important, and it's perfectly legal.
Mike, I think about Ken Griffin, right? He's been in Florida, maybe a couple of years, or it's been a couple of years since he announced moving down there. He's become very influential, certainly on the state. But I do think about, as you guys are laying out the causes that are of importance to him, he doesn't necessarily buy into the populism, does he, that Donald Trump seems to espouse along with J.D. Vance?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. He stresses that, and the people that are close to him stress that what he's looking for is candidates who are conservative, Republican, but also candidates that can governance. He likes to use that word a lot in a lot of things that he does in terms of giving. And I think he strives, or he says he strives to apply that to the candidates and the politicians that he decides to back. And he's quite loyal. He will stick with a politician that he believes in or feels like is worth backing through wins and through losses. And that seems to be a key driver of what he does. He wants leaders in Congress, especially, who will actually get things done, who will legislate the kind of things he wants Congress to do, that he supports. And he shies away from backing candidates that are less effective in governing, as he likes to call it.
Mike, what do we know about Citadel Public Affairs head Kason Carter?
Well, he's very key to this process. He wouldn't talk to us for this story, but he plays a pivotal role in helping Ken Griffin decide where to put his money, not just in political giving, but also in philanthropy, for example. So he's a pivotal sort of advisor in that realm.
Hey, Bill, when you look at the money that's been drummed up in this race so far, I think about, Kamala Harris, the money that she's raised since she has essentially taken over the mantle from Joe Biden. I think about, we just talked about Elon Musk, we're talking about Ken Griffin. It's a lot of money. I'm just curious, is this turning out to be one of the more expensive campaigns or races?
It's like it's going to be. I mean, it's, every presidential record sort of sets a record, or presidential election sets a record because, contribution limits go up, things get more expensive, super PACs are, play a bigger role. There was some thought that maybe the 2020 election, because of COVID, there would be less spending. It turned out there was more spending than ever. So I think we'll see more spending, and it's in part because, as Ken Griffin said or told us in the article, it's, there's a lot at stake in this election. It's an important time for the country, and all the money is coming out.
Bill, just 20 seconds left. Any whispers of campaign finance reform around the halls of Washington, D.C. these days? There are people who still plug away at it. It is not really a priority for Congress or this administration, and it hasn't been for years and years. I mean, the closest thing we have is some bills to disclose dark money, but, they get stuck in the Senate or the House and don't really go anywhere.
All right, well, if you weren't depressed enough, we're going to have some talk of climate change coming up in just a moment to keep the mood going. Bloomberg News national reporter Mike Smith and Bill Allison, Bloomberg News campaign finance reporter. This is a Bloomberg exclusive and among our most read on the Bloomberg terminal.
Still to come, we talk climate change on the other side. First up, though, a check on the latest world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. Israel's military struck Beirut, aiming at a Hezbollah commander in response to a rocket attack in the Golan Heights that killed 12 people on Saturday. Natasha Hall is a senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She says this was expected.
I was speaking to diplomats just a bit earlier than this, and there had been some evacuation of the Dahia, or this suburban area of Beirut that is also a Hezbollah stronghold. So many people in the area knew that this might be the targeted area and had been evacuating for some time. That said, we should still be aware of the civilian casualties that might be at play, because this is a neighborhood after all.
Natasha Hall speaking with Bloomberg's Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines. A top U.S. official said a communications breakdown between the Secret Service and local police was a major security failure surrounding the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Ronald Rowe is the acting head of the embattled Secret Service. He told senators his agency was ultimately responsible, but it was communication problems with local law enforcement that prevented his agents from doing their job. And we are watching the medal count in Paris. The women's gymnastics team with Simone Biles just won the gold. The U.S. has a total of 22 medals. Japan has the most gold at 7. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Tech stocks selling off, bonds and gold climbing as traders rush for safety amid geopolitical risks. The S&P right now is down 26 points to 5437, a drop now of 0.5%. Dow Industrials holding on to a gain of 163 points, up by about 0.4%. The Dow has been higher all day. We've got NASDAQ, though, down 188 points now, a drop of 1.1%. The NASDAQ 100 index also lower by 1.1%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares little changed, higher now by just under 0.2%. 10-year 4.14%, the 2-year 4.35%. Spot gold up 0.9%, 24.05 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 1.2%, 74.93 per barrel of WTI. All eyes will be on Microsoft after the close of trading, the first of 4 mega-cap tech names reporting this week. Microsoft ahead of earnings, down 1.5%. Meta Platforms reports tomorrow, down 0.4%. Apple on Thursday, little change right now, higher by just 5 cents. We've got Amazon also reporting Thursday, down now by 1%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed with the S&P 500 index down 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, you know this, the Olympics are underway. Yay. Stop sending me headlines because I really want to find out the results later when I go home. But
you also shouldn't listen then to, Amy Morris, who gives us some updates.
Love you, Amy, but
she tells us.
I don't want to know.
Okay. Sorry, Carol.
All right, meantime, not so great, though. Paris is forecast to reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit today. That's the hottest since 2022. And tonight expected to bring very little relief to the Olympic City. And then one more thing to kind of warm up your heart. Note our sarcasm. Yesterday was the hottest day, Tim, in recorded history.
Bloomberg opinion editor Mark Gongloff wrote last week that it is only going to get worse. I was not prepared for that. We're not prepared for that. Mark covers climate change, something that I think he would argue we're not prepared for. Generally and regularly freaks us out, although he does try to leave us with hope too. Mark joins us here in the studio. So it's hot in Paris, it's hot in London, a yellow heat health alert, elevated risk for people over 65. That's in place for much of England until Friday. In Greece, there were 54 wildfires in the 24 hours to 6:30 p.m. yesterday. Fires in Canada. Northern California is burning. Drought in Africa after just a few months ago dealing with deadly floods. And we're out of time for you to tell us why.
Yeah, that about sums it up.
Happy Tuesday, everybody.
Glad to be here.
You okay?
Yeah.
Everything okay?
Yeah, that's about it.
Okay. What's good?
What's good? Well, I guess it's interesting. The Olympic thing comes at a time when they built the Olympic Village to not use air conditioning, which caused a lot of controversy at the time. And in fact, the U.S. and some other teams brought their own air conditioning. They're like, we're not going to do this. So it's going to be a real test tonight because it's going to be real hot today, but it's going to still be hot at night. And that's kind of the worst thing is when you can't cool off at night. Fortunately, it is the good news, I guess, is it is going to kind of cool down tomorrow in Paris. It's going to be like 90, which is still pretty hot. But you will get
Bring
a break.
out the coats.
I know. You'll get a break in the weather, but then you'll also have a bunch of rain, which is going to make the Seine impossible to swim in for another few days.
Which they already had to postpone.
Triathlon,
yeah. Having said that, my daughter spent last summer in Paris and working, and she's like, nobody has air conditioning because they never have had air conditioning. I grew up, there was like a week where mom and dad were like, let's put on the air conditioning. Northern New Jersey, like it wasn't hot. You can't live without air conditioning now, it feels like, and not everybody has it.
Right. And especially in cooler places. You talk about New Jersey, where I live now. I used to visit New Jersey all the time. I grew up in South Carolina where it was constantly like the surface of the sun. And I would go to New Jersey to visit my grandmother and be like, oh, this is pleasant. It's cool at night. It's beautiful. It's not like that anymore. It's kind of like South Carolina now. I mean, the planet has heated up. Parts of the country have heated up more than others. And that's what we're starting to experience. And so places that like Seattle or places like that don't have a lot of air conditioning, that aren't used to the heat, if they get a big heat wave like we saw a few years ago, then those people really suffer a lot. And so that's one of the risks we face. That's one of the reasons we're not totally prepared for what's coming to us.
I think what's interesting is you two are sharing anecdotes of a period of time that was not very long ago.
Right.
And I wonder what and we've seen a difference in a very short period of time. What does that portend for the next 10, 20, 30 years, Mark, if we don't get this under control? Well, and by we, I mean the collective human
Right, the collective we. I guess the good news is that we do still have some control over this. There is some heat baked into it. We've heated up about 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial averages. Kind of feels like a meaningless number, but all the stuff that you're seeing now, these massive wildfires that are getting so hot that they create like fire nados and create their own weather systems. They create lightning and stuff because they're burning so hot. That kind of stuff is coming after just 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming on average of the planet. If we don't get our act together, we're looking at maybe 3 or 4 degrees Celsius of warming. If we do get our act together, maybe we can limit it to 1.5 or 2, and that's the best case scenario. So that this is kind of the new-ish normal, and we will still have some more of this sort of adjustment to deal with. But we can do that but we have to get our act together fairly quickly.
What do you say to those people that, all right, the climate's always changing, and we've gone through hot periods thousands of years ago, and look, here we are. It's so lovely.
Well, you talked about the record, the hottest day, as far as we know, and scientists have gone to the bottom of lakes and scraped up debris down there to figure out what the temperature was, because there weren't thermometers around 125,000 years ago. We had other problems.
We could build pyramids, but we couldn't build them. All right, we'll discuss that later.
Yeah, anything. We don't have records,
yeah.
But they've been able to dig it up, and they can see that it's the hottest it's been in 125,000 years, at least. The climate is always changing, but what's happened lately is we've sort of speed run heating that usually takes thousands of years. You'll have 100,000 years going into an ice age, 100,000 years coming out, and we've been in like 6,000 years of a very nice, pleasant temperature in which civilization has grown. We've, created antibiotics and Stanley Cups and everything. We've had like a great civilization, but now the heat is so much that we're starting to push the limits of survivability, and we're going to have to learn to adapt to that.
So you're saying because the ramp up in heat has happened in a shorter period of time, it's much more serious.
Exactly. It's raising 1.5 degrees Celsius would ordinarily take thousands of years, and the rest of that, if we get to 3 or 4, that's only going to take another decade or 2, or maybe 5. But if it takes 5 decades, again, compared to geologic time, that's the blink of an eye, and that is hard for us and for the rest of the planet to adjust to.
I think one thing that might be a challenge for people to think about is the way that lawmakers don't necessarily think about the long term. I think critics would say. You can think about it from a transportation perspective. I mean, you and I have talked a lot about the challenges getting between New York and New Jersey. And, had lawmakers 30, 40 years ago thought about this, then there would be more tunnels for less money between New Jersey and New York.
Yeah.
But that type of political long-term thinking is very difficult for politicians to do.
Yeah.
Infrastructure-wise, what about when it comes to climate resilience?
It's the same thing, and it's a little bit better because you can see it's in your face the things that you need to do. And so, say with wildfires, for example, we know that the sort of things we need to do. California has really ramped up its response capabilities. It's started working on building fire breaks and that sort of thing. But we are still rebuilding houses in wildfire-prone areas. We're subsidizing the rebuilding of houses in wildfire-prone areas, in flood-prone areas. We still have not come to grips with the fact that we need to move out of these places because people don't want to pay more for insurance, and politicians don't want to force people to pay more for insurance because you lose elections. You talk about that tunnel to New Jersey. We did think about that 20 years ago, but we decided not to do it because Chris Christie wanted to not raise gas taxes before an election. And so we didn't get that tunnel then. Now we got to wait till 2035 to get the new tunnel.
The upbeat moment that you need to leave us with?
Yeah, we have a minute left.
Yeah, I've got a minute to do the upbeat stuff. I mean, you talk about the
I need to be picked up off the floor, please.
Okay, I will, or I'll try. The upbeat thing is that, yes, it is hard to get people to see around those corners, but we have started to see that. I mean, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest climate bill we've ever seen. People in the Republican Party are starting to think about this, too. They know that they need to come to grips with it. The young people in their party and throughout this country are worrying about this more. There was an Alliance thing, where a survey that Alliance did, where they asked its clients by generation, if they were worried about their finances being impacted by climate change. And I think only 32% of baby boomers said yes, but 70% of millennials said yes. And you can see that shifting up by generation. And so,
our
the
kids
children
are hopefully
our
going to
future.
save us,
Yes.
right?
So, yeah.
All right. It's a little upbeat. We'll take it. Mark Ongloff, thank you always. Bloomberg Opinion Editor Mark Ongloff joining us. Coming up, we're going to get into a buy one, get one deal that isn't quite maybe necessarily working out like it's supposed to.
Yeah, we'll give you the details right after this. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg. Now, your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. A year after Warren Buffett called his multi-billion-dollar bet on Bank of America an investment worth keeping, he is selling it down. Berkshire Hathaway disclosed its third disposal of its shares this month, pairing its massive, profitable bet on the lender by a total of more than $3 billion. Now, according to a regulatory filing, the conglomerate, which has started building an investment in the bank in 2011 and has long reigned as the top shareholder, sold $767 million of the stock from July 25th to July 29th. That and prior sales this month reduced Berkshire's stake by a total of 6.9%. Shares of Bank of America, they're down today by 0.5%. Berkshire Hathaway shares, the Class A stock, up by 0.3%. Procter & Gamble reported quarterly sales that missed analyst projections as the maker of Pampers diapers and Tide detergents slows its pace of price increases. Procter & Gamble shares today, they are tumbling by 5.7%. Sprouts Farmers Market surging today after the natural and organic food retailer boosted its full-year projections for comparable sales and profit. BofA upgraded the stock with a $100 price target. Wells Fargo also upgraded the stock stock with a $90 price target. Shares of Sprouts today, they are advancing up by 13.8%. JetBlue Airways is going to cut $3 billion in capital spending through 2029 and plans other measures to boost pre-tax income by as much as $900 million, all part of a sweeping plan by its new CEO to restructure operations. JetBlue right now up by 10.4%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellett, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. Israel's military struck Beirut, aiming at a Hezbollah commander in response to a rocket attack from Saturday in the Golan Heights that killed 12 people. Israel blames the Lebanon-based militant group for the weekend attack. Natasha Hall is a senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and says the U.S. is working to make sure a wider conflict doesn't break out.
Joe Biden and others within the administration are working very, very hard not to see that regional escalation, because that would essentially mean a two-front war for Israel as well.
Natasha Hall speaking with Bloomberg's Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines. Venezuela's government is engaging in a full crackdown on any resistance to President Nicolas Maduro's self-declared victory, announcing 749 arrests and detaining prominent opposition figure Freddy Supolino. The arrests followed Maduro's live stream, which was broadcast to X last night, in which he said protesters would be severely prosecuted after thousands of Venezuelans took to the streets of Caracas, decrying what they say is a fraudulent win. And we're watching the medal count in Paris. Carol, close your ears. The women's gymnastics team with Simone Biles won the gold. The U.S. has a total of 22 medals now. France has 17. China has 14. And Japan has the most gold medals at 7. Global news 24 hours a day whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec.
I never close my ears. I never close my ears when Amy is talking. We don't have, Carol, we don't have rights to that music. You can't sing that.
I don't want to know.